Thank you. I'm going to give you a case study of the three Baltic countries, which have some striking similarities with Slovakia, but some notable differences as well. And when I'm talking about Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, they usually get lumped together as the three Baltic countries, but of course they all have separate approaches, differences, but I would argue that it is still fair to look at them as a group, as they usually are, because generally they have shared similar positions and similar agendas, but there are, of course, differences of emphasis. I will naturally look at them from more of an Estonian perspective, being Estonian. If I get anything wrong about Lithuania, my colleague Ramunas will correct me, but there's no Latvian here to correct any errors I might make in their regard. But in general, looking at the Baltic states, one commonly observes that Estonia has a very distinctive course, Lithuania as well, and Latvians, it's generally the stereotype that they're somewhere in between, as they are geographically. And I think this holds as well when we look at their experience and actions within the European Union during the past decade. I think during the accession period, they had a very similar approach. Estonia, of course, was a bit quicker off the mark than the other two, which provided, say, a competitive stimulus to Latvia and Lithuania to quickly catch up. But they both shared, all three countries shared the same general strategy, which was informed by their history from the Second World War, where they were neutral countries, but that didn't save them from being wiped off the map, to be never alone again without allies. So the general thrust of their policies from the pre-accession period, I think right to the present, has strongly been to embed themselves into as dense and tight network of international organizations, Western alliances, as possible. And this holds true for the 1990s as it does for 2014, and it's even a logic that applies for Eurozone membership, where security is one of the major concerns, unlike for all the other countries which had previously joined the Eurozone. And I think all three countries recognized in the 90s that they had a window of opportunity that they had to seize to join the EU, Russia being weak, Europe exhibiting goodwill towards their neighbors. But they were in the weakest starting point, clearly, because they were differentiated from the former Warsaw Pact countries. The former Soviet Union was a red line, geopolitical red line, and there was always the question of, will this upset the Russians, and we have to take that into account. And also being part of the Soviet Union meant that they were also economically weakest and the most poor candidate countries from Central Eastern Europe. So they had to get over those hurdles, and the factor which helped them greatly was that this enlargement was so much focused on objective criteria, which wasn't so much the case in previous rounds of enlargement. So the Balts, having these unfavorable factors which I just outlined, geopolitical factors primarily, could make the case that if we are the best pupils in the class, then you can't leave us behind the door. And President Ilves, then Foreign Minister Ilves, who was leading the charge in Estonia, was often say, not publicly, but that Poland was our benchmark, that if we fall behind Poland in closing chapters, then we're lost. But if we can prove that we're objectively ahead in the reform process of Poland, then they can't close the door on us, because it was clear that for a country like Poland, it was a question of when, whereas for us it was also a question of if we get into the Union or not. So here, I think, is the genesis of this policy which the three Baltic states have by and large to the present followed, of trying to be demonstrating their credentials as good Europeans, and there hasn't been very much backsliding on that to the present because of the omnipresence of this security Russia dimension, which Slovakia doesn't seem to care about as much. But this process was clearly elite driven. And if we look a bit at the public opinion, which was the topic of our previous session, then Estonia and Latvia were amongst the Central and East European countries the ones prior to accession which had the weakest support for EU membership. And the referenda were scheduled in Estonia and Latvia at the very end for tactical reasons in September 2013, when everyone else had voted in favor, to basically the elites to pressure the population to make that choice, because you don't want to remain isolated and alone. Lithuania, of course, was different in this case. Lithuania had exhibited much greater zeal, and perhaps Ramonas can expand on that later. So, having joined low public support and the first sort of experience in the Union, the Convention on the Future of Europe, when the new member states are asked to contribute and present their vision, well, I'd say the Balts were fairly lost in this exercise, not having any experience of how it works from the inside, and Estonia in particular were dragged along by the Brits and followed that same program of no more harmonization in social policy and in taxation, in common foreign security policy, defense policy, all these sectors. And of course, we have to keep in mind as well that together with EU enlargement, it was Nato enlargement, and NATO enlargement was much more popular amongst Estonians, Latvians, and Lithuanians than EU enlargement. And at the time, there was the mantra of, as in other Central and East European countries, of no duplication. So a general wariness towards expanding European competences in security and defense. That has changed, and I'm going to come to that later. So the interesting point that I'm, I think, trying to make is how they came in to the Union favoring the status quo, favoring intergovernmentalism, and how they quickly learned that the community method was indeed the most favorable method for small member states. And it was basically, I would argue, then the actual experience of being in the Union that quickly taught them that the only way to keep the large powers, the large member states from steamrolling over them and pushing their own interests was the community method. And perhaps a watershed moment here was in 2005 for Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, which was the Nord Stream deal. Putin and Schröder making the deal which, for the Baltic Sea pipeline from Russia to Germany, which ignored the Baltic States and Poland, and this caused a lot of public commotion, also bad historical memories of when the Germans and Russians agree upon something without consulting the countries in between. Lots of course, emotional exaggeration and hysteria, but it drove the realization that the demand that Europe must have a common policy towards Russia, and Europe should have a common energy policy and should speak with one voice. That was being said. And then the realization that, well, if we demand this in one sector, that logically, of course, we should be following a pro-integrationist community method approach across the board. And this, I think, was the moment when Baltic policies began to shift. And policymakers certainly realized that at this point, but it took a little bit longer for the public to come along. But it's also, I think, demonstrated by, at the same time, I mentioned the convention and, well, the constitutional treaty. Again, the Lithuanians were a bit exceptional because they wanted to demonstrate their zeal of being good Europeans and were the very first member state to ratify the constitutional treaty. But the Estonians and Latvians were very hesitant and only approved after the French and Dutch had already said no. So when it was safe to do so. But when it came to Lisbon a few years later, then there was no debate whatsoever. Ratification went very quickly and very smoothly. And the main selling point for the Baltic publics was that what Lisbon does is give Europe a stronger voice. And particularly this common foreign security policy, speaking in one voice towards Russia, was what the public expected from Lisbon. Now, moving on then, this moving, as I have in my title here, from the periphery to the core, perhaps the greatest example of this is joining the Eurozone. And joining the Eurozone at a time when the foundations of the euro itself were collapsing. They actually made a first attempt unsuccessfully in the boom years. 2006, Estonia and Lithuania both were set to apply. The Estonian Prime Minister Ansip, who just resigned this year, at that time withdrew Estonia's, or didn't withdraw the application, but actually never tabled the application, because our economy was booming at Chinese rates, double digits in 2005, 2006, and said, well, if it's a choice between the Eurozone or rapid economic growth, then we choose rapid economic growth. Well, 2008, things turned out differently. But Lithuania went ahead with this, and Lithuania was humiliated by being rejected with having exceeding the inflation criteria by 0.1. But they had a second chance when this boom turned to bust in 2008, 2009, and the Baltic States suffered in the beginning and more severely than other member states. In 2009, Latvia's GDP went down by 18%, Lithuania's by 15%, Estonia's by 14%. So during the financial crisis, they had a real sharp drop in the beginning, but then by 2011, they were already recovered. By 2012, they were the strongest growing economies in the Union, so that a real roller coaster ride. But this financial crisis provided them an opportunity. And for Estonia, which then was the first to join in January 2011, it was really seen as an exit strategy from the financial crisis, and also a way of making austerity palatable. In other words, we're not making cuts simply for the sake of being tough, but we have now a national goal. And it was part of joining the Eurozone, was part of not being second-class Europeans. Well, getting into Schengen in 2007 was part of that, but there was still the feeling that there's the core group and we are still sort of out there on the periphery, but joining the Euro sort of solidified our identity as being really part of the first class in Europe. And also, as I alluded to earlier, Prime Minister Ansip, being the first Prime Minister to say that joining the Euro is explicitly saying that it's a matter of national security, not just economic security, but national security in the widest sense. So it was a successful exit strategy. It was also terribly important at that time to differentiate Estonia from Latvia, because the crisis began in Latvia. They were hit hardest in the beginning. They were the first EU country to get an IMF program. They were the first EU country to exit successfully the program. They were the only Baltic country to be on the program. But since the Baltic states are always lumped together as one, then all of the international analysis and commentary at the time in 2009 was that the Latvians won't be able to do it. This internal devaluation, all three countries, their currencies were pegged to the euro, and politically they rejected the idea of devaluation. So joining the euro was the alternative through the austerity measures. So economists like Krugman were very critical about this, saying it can't be done. And for Estonians, it was joining the euro was sort of a speculative attack on the Latvian currency, that we would differentiate. The Latvians have bigger problems, but we're not all, because all the international stories were if Latvians will be forced to devalue it, then of course Estonia and Lithuania will naturally have to follow. So showing that we were on the path to the euro was a way of differentiating ourselves from our southern neighbors. And the Latvians caught up. They joined at the beginning of this year, and the Lithuanians will be joining at the beginning of next year, hopefully. And after having joined in 2011, Estonia also joined the OECD at the same time, more or less. Our President Ilves could go around claiming that Estonia is the most integrated country in Northern Europe, being the only one in the Eurozone, OECD, NATO, and the EU. No other Northern European country having that combination, and also portraying itself as the anti-growth Greece as sort of the countries that follow the rules, as we heard here a little bit on the Slovak case. And of course, for the general public, there was lots of anguish about the European Stability Mechanism, the ESM, because the general public didn't understand why we had to help countries which were richer than we are. The figure that was always touted was that the average pension in Greece is higher than the average salary in Estonia, and we follow the rules, they broke the rules, why do we have to go along with this? But that was the public discourse. But unlike Slovakia, which we just heard from, the elites, the governing parties, parliamentary parties were all solidly in favor of the ESM. And there the logic of appropriateness was that it wasn't appropriate for a country which had just joined to start putting its demands on the table, that we have to be polite and behave if we've just become the newest member in this club. So that worked against what seemed to be common sense for the Estonians. But it was the only case when debate on the future of Europe actually became a hot public issue within Estonia. And it was actually taken to the Estonian Supreme Court in the summer of 2012 by actually the ombudsman, or the legal chancellor in Estonia, for supposedly contravening the Estonian constitution. It was only by one vote that the Supreme Court actually approved the ESM, or Estonia's joining it. But to continue on these sort of financial arguments, Estonia even also announced at the same time that it will be joining or it supports the financial transaction tax, which is very surprising for a country which has sort of known and has a very liberal government. So it goes against the political ideology, but it was a price to be paid to remain at the core. Now I'm rapidly coming to the end of my time, but I want to say a few words about the impact of the Baltic States on the Union and sort of the uploading of the Baltic agenda onto the Union's agenda. And first and foremost, this has had to do with the relationship with Russia, of course. That, of course, the relationship with Russia has always been on the agenda, but it became much more relevant because of the three Baltic states. There was hope in the three Baltic states initially that once we've joined, our bilateral problems with Moscow will be solved, because Moscow will have to deal directly with Brussels, and there'll be a single voice, and we're taken care of. Well, that didn't turn out to be quite that way. Moscow had the opposite message, that differentiating the new and the old member states, saying very explicitly that the old member states should teach these immature new member states how to behave towards Russia, that they should not listen to these paranoid, Russophobic new member states. And indeed, the new member states, particularly not just the Baltic states, pushed the idea of sort of memory politics onto the agenda, the condemnation of the crimes of communism by not just the European Parliament, but in the Council of Europe, OSCE, and everywhere else. And memory politics, this conflict with Russia, was also perhaps the most tense moment in this decade of EU membership, when in 2007 the Estonian government removed, or actually relocated, a Soviet war memorial, which caused 3 days of riots and some massive cyber attack against Estonia, but also raised Estonia's public support of the EU to record high levels, being much higher than anyone else in the Union, when Estonians finally realized that it's not just a economic union, but it has very strong elements of political solidarity. And a high point in this was the EU-Russia summit in May 2008, when Barroso, sitting beside Putin at the press conference, says that it's a union of solidarity, that the problem with Estonia is a problem with the Union. It was a failed summit, but it was sort of music to the ears of a Baltic person, that we are not being left alone by ourselves. Agenda setting to continue, well, 2008 we have the Russia-Georgia war. The Baltic leaders and the Polish president go to Tbilisi in the midst of the war, talking about a wake-up call and a paradigm shift. Well, the snooze button was hit there in 2004 with Ukraine, and we have déjà vu again. So we failed to be an agenda setter in that. I must mention, however, that the Baltic States, that Lithuania has been perhaps more vocal than the others, that Estonia and Latvia have tried to continue to be along with the mainstream in all questions, seeking the common voice, and particularly regarding Russia, that it's the only time a Baltic country has used a veto was in 2008 when Lithuania blocked the mandate for the launch of the EU-Russia Partnership and Cooperation Agreement. And in that, Estonia and Latvia didn't support Lithuania because they felt that having the common EU position was more important. I could give you many more examples here, but my time is up, and I'll just read my conclusion to you here, which is 2 sentences, or 3 or 4. The Balts have progressed from harboring some initial hesitation regarding deeper integration to rapidly becoming one of the most enthusiastic proponents of the EU, speaking with one voice. As small states, they've consistently viewed the Commission as its best ally and supported efforts to strengthen that body. That many of the priority issues within the Union have in one way or another been related to security concerns in Russia. The experience of witnessing member states pursue their own national interests at the expense of common EU position in these 2 areas in particular made the Baltic states quickly realize the pressing need for further integration. The Balts have sought to move from the periphery to the core of the EU, and within the first decade of the membership of the Union, they have managed successfully to do so, and the most obvious indicator being the example of all 3 joining the Eurozone. Thank you.